Hi, folks, and welcome to How Can Acupoint Tapping Change Deep Emotional Learnings? Let me introduce to you the incredible David Feinstein. He is a clinical psychologist. He has served on the faculty of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He's received 9 national awards for his books on consciousness and healing. He and his wife, Donna have built the world's largest organization teaching energy medicine. David's contributions in helping conceptualize energy psychology have been enormous. In fact, every major paper that's conceptual, I think, has been his, just about. Receiving ASAP's outstanding contribution award to the field, both in 2002 and 2012. And I don't think anybody else but him has gotten that. Ladies and gentlemen, David Feinstein.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I am so glad to be here. I'm so impressed with ASAP and with Bob for having totally retooled yourselves so that this conference is being broadcast all over the world. I'm I know how much work that took. And so I'm really pleased that we get to share this time together. And as Bob mentioned, and as you see on the screen, the question we're asking is, how can acupoint tapping change deep emotional learnings? We'll begin with excerpts from a session in which acupoint tapping does indeed seem to have brought about rapid improvement with the difficult clinical condition. Then we'll step by step formulate a theory about why it worked. So our first question is, what are the criteria for a scientific theory? A theory explains something that can't be directly observed, such as how tapping brings about a change in a deep emotional learning, with what can be directly observed, such as clinical outcomes or biological changes or brain scans. And it combines these with established principles that are independent of what is being explained, such as empirically supported concepts in psychology and medicine. The problem with the theories that energy psychology has proposed is that they sound, in the ears of our colleagues, too much like the explanation in the cartoon. They often rely on ancient understanding, metaphysical concepts, or metaphors from quantum physics that go beyond established scientific principles or observations. But if we want to speak to the scientific community, we need to limit ourselves to established scientific principles and empirical observation. I've personally been told by 2 leaders within the American Psychological Association that as long as the mechanisms of action for energy psychology seem implausible, no other evidence is going to convince them. So we will limit ourselves to established principles and empirical observation as we try to be more explicit about this part of the equation. We'll attempt to build an empirically based theory to unravel the mystery of how tapping can bring about the rapid clinical improvements that are being reported. One more quality of a theory is that it can be tested by experiment and observation. We'll submit our theory to a preliminary test by applying it toward the end of the presentation to the case you're about to witness. So let's view the treatment session. You may have seen the late Eric Hiory's powerful documentary, Operation Emotional Freedom. 9 combat veterans who had suffered for decades with severe PTSD were provided EFT treatments over a 5-day period. For our purposes, any of these 9 veterans who experienced a rapid recovery after a few tapping sessions seems a reasonable case in point for testing the theory we're building. For context, keep in mind as you watch the session that 2/3 of veterans who have completed recommended treatments in the VA still carry a PTSD diagnosis after treatment. In this 2-minute compilation, you will see a pre-treatment list of symptoms of one of the veterans in the documentary, snippets from his initial interview, snippets from the treatment, the symptom status on follow-up, and snippets from an exit meeting at the end of the 5 days. I'll start it now.
And I know that I got to talk about it. I know I got to get through it. And I know what, you know, there's the after effect. And then the fucking nightmares are going to start again. The intrusive thoughts are going to start again. And I'm going to replay this whole thing all over again. But I know eventually I have to, because I'm going to destroy it or it's going to destroy me. I feel like I'll throw up.
You what?
I'll throw up.
He came back, his face was ashen and everything, and we just kept tapping on it. What other pieces of this memory are showing up? The sight, the sound, what?
Mostly the body parts and the blood and the smell. I can feel it. You can see it.
Okay. All right, here. Even though I have this blood in these body parts.
Even though I have these blood body parts.
In my mind.
In my mind.
In my memory.
In my memory.
It's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago.
It's not really here right now.
It's not really here with me.
The next day we collapsed it still further and further and further till he would just talk about it like it was nothing.
We just started pulling bodies out.
And how many bodies were there?
I think all total there was 15 killed. You know, it's amazing how I feel right now. I can actually talk about it calmly.
I would say that I've never seen anything that can start with a symptom of very high anxiety, of insomnia, of hyperarousal, and have that disappear in the course of a few days' time. That's extraordinary.
And I mean this sincerely, especially, you know, talking to, you know, brother vets and veterans. If you want to try EFT, I'm sure there's a way that they'll let you know about it and give it a shot, because I'm living proof of this, you know, so hang in there.
We'll return to Bob after we formulated our theory to see if it explains what we just witnessed. We'll be building the theory on 6 premises about energy psychology that each has strong empirical support. The first is that energy psychology protocols are effective with a range of conditions. Second, the results are durable. Third, the results are surprisingly rapid. Fourth, biological markers show that the changes are not just subjective. Fifth, the tapping, rather than other components of the protocol, is necessary for the rapid outcomes. And sixth, stimulating selected acupuncture points sends signals that can increase or decrease arousal in targeted brain areas. These premises are the pillars on which we will build our theory. We'll briefly review the evidence supporting each of them. The first is that energy psychology protocols are effective with a range of conditions. An unprecedented number of case reports have been appearing for nearly 40 years, many as dramatic as what you just saw, with literally thousands of them posted on the internet. But case reports need to be backed by clinical trials. When I first started paying attention to energy psychology in 2001, 0 peer-reviewed studies showing that it worked were available, 0. Today, more than 120 clinical trials supporting the speed and efficacy of energy psychology protocols have been published in peer-reviewed journals. Many have appeared in prominent publications. The first 4 of these are American Psychological Association journals. Beyond the 120 clinical trials or studies, meta-analyses that statistically evaluate a number of clinical trials to formulate conclusions that can't be derived from the individual trials alone. Meta-analyses reviewing clinical trials of energy psychology have focused on 3 diagnostic categories: anxiety, PTSD, and depression. In 14 tapping studies looking at anxiety, with a total of 658 participants, the effect size was 1.23. An effect size is a single number. The larger the number, the greater the size of the impact of the effect of the treatment being investigated. An effect size of 0.2 is considered a small effect. 0.5 is a medium effect. 0.8 is considered a large effect. So 1.23 is a very large effect. In seven tapping studies looking at PTSD, with a total of 247 participants, the effect size was 2.96, which is a very, very large effect. In 12 studies looking at depression, with a total of 398 participants, the effect size was 1.85, which was, again, a very large effect. In brief, very large effects were produced when tapping protocols were applied in the treatment of anxiety, PTSD, and depression. All 37 studies analyzed in the anxiety, PTSD, and depression meta-analyses used acupoint tapping protocols as the primary intervention. So you can assume that some, if not many, of the investigators had a stake or even a bias toward the method. Two comprehensive reviews whose investigators were decidedly not advocates of energy psychology are telling. An impartial way of assessing the effectiveness of a clinical approach is to see how it compares with other therapies in treating the same condition. A study that appeared in the journal Psychological Medicine did a meta-analysis of psychological treatments for children who suffered the effects of trauma. The 32 studies reviewed included the use of cognitive behavior therapy, narrative exposure, EMDR, and other popular trauma treatments. Only one of the 32 studies used an acupoint tapping approach, thought field therapy. Effect sizes range from 0.09, a weak effect, to 4.19, which is an extraordinarily large effect. The average effect size across the groups was 1.47, which is still a large effect. The strongest effect of all 32 treatments, the 4.19, was produced by TFT. The study was published in 2017, and Psychological Medicine is a journal of Cambridge University Press. Could this have been an anomaly, a lucky shot? Another comprehensive meta-analysis of interventions for treating traumatized children, published in the highly influential Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, reviewed 32 studies which investigated 17 different interventions, including CBT, exposure therapy, EMDR, narrative therapy, play therapy, family therapy, meditation, and EFT. EFT was first or second in most of the categories, including being the most effective of the 17 interventions in retaining improvement in PTSD symptoms on follow-up. While the report emphasizes that variances in the data collected make some of the findings tentative or inconclusive, the study lends corroboration to the Psychological Medicine study. In both studies, tapping protocols appear to have been more effective than the other interventions in treating traumatized children. In addition to anxiety, PTSD, depression, and a range of other clinical conditions, studies of acupoint tapping protocols have also found statistically significant improvements in markers for happiness, improved athletic performance, and a variety of physical conditions, including fibromyalgia, psoriasis, tension headaches, weight management, frozen shoulder, traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, chemotherapy side effects, and seizures. With the meta-analysis showing large effect sizes following tapping treatments for anxiety, PTSD, and depression, and other studies showing improvements in positive indicators for happiness and a range of physical conditions, we can say with reasonable confidence that substantial empirical evidence supports our first premise about the effectiveness of energy psychology protocols. There is a caveat. Many of the early clinical trials have been criticized as having weak research designs. However, more recent research is redeeming them in that similar results are being found in studies coming out of universities, studies that adhere to high research standards. The older as well as more recent and more rigorous studies consistently support our first premise. To the second premise, the critical question when looking at outcome data is, are the outcomes durable? Both clinicians and clients widely report that once a problematic emotional response and all its aspects have been fully addressed with tapping, it tends not to return. These reports are backed now by follow-up studies that track whether the outcomes measured directly after the treatment have persisted 1 month, 6 months, a year, or even 2 years later. Nearly half of the clinical trials have done follow-up. They have consistently found the improvements to be durable. Here is a simulated plot of the baseline functioning, improvements during the treatment, and sustained improvement. So we have a body of clinical literature demonstrating the effectiveness and durability of treatment. How about speed? One of the claims that the clinical community has had the most difficulty accepting is the reported speed by which long-standing problems can be overcome using energy psychology protocols. Is there empirical backing for this premise? Statistically significant symptom reduction after a single session has been reported in psychological conditions ranging from phobias to marked improvements in PTSD to some of the physical disorders we looked at earlier, such as frozen shoulder. Do these documented single session outcomes mean that energy psychology produces faster improvement than other therapies? To make that claim, we need clinical trials that show head-to-head comparisons. The conventional standard of care for many psychological conditions is cognitive behavior therapy. In 6 of 6 studies, tapping required fewer sessions than CBT to produce equivalent or stronger outcomes. Conditions studied included generalized anxiety disorder, test-taking anxiety, food cravings, agoraphobia, anxiety in teens, and a study that measured both depression and anxiety. Accumulating evidence is showing that energy psychology protocols produce unusually rapid outcomes. Another question that must be asked is whether the reported changes are based solely on subjective experience, which can be influenced by many factors, or if biological markers that impact psychological functioning show that the changes are not just subjective. Several biological markers have been established, including decreased cortisol levels, improvements on cardiovascular measures, immune function, gene expression, the activation of specific brain areas as measured by blood flow, which can be shown with fMRI and other imaging devices, and an optimization of brain wave ratios. Gary Grossbeck and Donna Back, who have done hundreds of EEG readings during tapping sessions, use digital EEG equipment. The digital EEG allows the brainwave changes to be shown on a monitor in real time during the tapping session, or even projected for an audience, as in this class. That's me, and that's the woman I led through the tapping session. She was wearing EEG sensors, and you could watch patterns change during the tapping, showing reduced distress, improved left-right hemisphere synchronization, and an optimization of brainwave ratios. In addition to these 6 established physiological changes, we can also infer from clinical experience and systematic outcome studies that other biological markers will be found when they are investigated. Prime candidates would include the regulation of additional hormones, such as adrenaline, the secretion of neurotransmitters, such as serotonin and dopamine, and the activation of the vagus nerve's social engagement system. But the biological markers that have already been identified by scientific instruments and laboratory measures establish our 4th premise, that biological markers show that the changes are not just subjective. which leads to our fifth premise, that the tapping is necessary for the rapid outcomes. Even if energy psychology protocols do bring about the psychological improvements shown in the clinical trials and the biological changes shown in the laboratory studies, is it the tapping that causes the changes? Or are they caused by other components of energy psychology protocols? The claim that the tapping causes the rapid outcomes that follow energy psychology treatments has in fact been vehemently questioned. Explanations that better align with conventional thinking include that any positive outcomes from tapping are due to the nature of a caring relationship, or the imaginal exposure that eventually leads to extinguishing a fear, or the placebo power of high expectations, or the relaxation and hypnotic effects of repetitive physical movements, or the cognitive effects of the words that are used during the tapping. Even though I hate everyone I meet, I deeply love and accept myself. In short, the psychotherapy establishment has not been persuaded that stimulating acupuncture points can create psychotherapeutic change. And it is plausible that the caring therapeutic relationship, the imaginal exposure, the words, and other non-specific factors are the primary ingredients for the change. 6 studies have addressed this question. They compared a standard energy psychology protocol with an identical protocol, except that the acupoint tapping was substituted with a different intervention, such as diaphragmatic breathing or tapping on points that aren't acupuncture points, referred to as sham points. These studies were evaluated in a meta-analysis that was published in the prestigious Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. The meta-analysis concluded that acupoint tapping is an essential ingredient for the speed and impact being found in the clinical trials. This was above and beyond the effects of placebo or other non-specific clinical factors, such as a caring therapist or the client's expectation. So we have reasonably solid support for our 5th premise, that acupoint tapping is an essential ingredient in the rapid improvement seen in the clinical trials and laboratory studies. This leads to our 6th point, which addresses the question, just what does tapping on an acupuncture point do? Our premise is that the therapeutic action of stimulating selected acupuncture points is in their ability to send signals that can increase or decrease arousal in targeted brain areas. That's a big claim. Let's unpack it piece by piece. First of all, what are acupuncture points? At least 361 points on the surface of the skin are recognized in traditional Chinese medicine as having special properties. In modern terms, these include higher electrical conductivity and lower electrical resistance compared to neighboring areas of the skin. This is why acupuncture points have been called windows into the body's energy system. Most acupuncture points are also located in areas with a high density of free nerve endings. So acupuncture points have distinctive anatomical features that help explain how they might have an enhanced effect on the body's electrical activity. The next question is, how can tapping on these points send signals to the brain? A well-established principle is that cells can convert a mechanical stimulus, such as pressure on the skin, into electrical activity. This is well known, and it's a process that's called mechanosensory transduction. And if you've been hanging around the energy psychology community, you've probably also run into the term piezoelectricity. Piezoelectricity literally means electricity caused by pressure. Certain large proteins within the membranes of cells convert mechanical pressure into electricity. But even if tapping on the skin generates electrical impulses, this raises another question. How do these electrical impulses get carried to the brain? and virtually instantaneously. The path by which the electrical signals travel appears to be along the body's connective tissue. It may not be a coincidence that the majority of acupoints happen to be located above large aggregates of connective tissue. Connective tissue is composed largely of collagen. Because collagen conducts electricity, signals can quickly reach specific areas of the body, rather than having to travel neuron to synapse to neuron through the nervous system. Here's a finding about the connective tissue that sheds light on the mechanisms of acupuncture. One of the persistent objections to acupuncture rests in the question, if the body has meridians, why haven't they been detected? Research into the connective tissue begins to explain this enigma. Correspondences have been found between the body's connective tissue and the acupuncture meridians. This is an amazing finding. It was discovered by Helene Langevin, then at Harvard Medical School. And it suggests that the anatomical basis of the meridians has been concealed within the body's connective tissue. If further research supports this conclusion, one of the primary objections about the proposed mechanisms of acupuncture will have been addressed. Which brings us to another question. It may seem self-evident that the changes on biological markers brought about by tapping, such as decreased cortisol production, turning on genes for emotional regulation, and optimizing brainwave patterns, would have a generally positive effect on mood and sense of well-being, which it does. But how do the highly specific changes we see in psychotherapy involving deeply embedded emotional learnings, such as overcoming a spider phobia, come about? A 10-year research program by a different group at Harvard Medical School used fMRI and other imaging equipment to study the effects of stimulating selected acupuncture points on various brain areas. One of their findings was, for me, a pivotal insight for understanding why we see immediate effects right in front of our eyes when stimulating acupuncture points. It has to do with activity in the amygdala, the part of the limbic system that detects threat and initiates the fight, flight, freeze response. The Harvard researchers found that stimulating certain acupuncture points sends signals to the amygdala that reduce threat activation almost instantly. With little talk, you can promptly turn off hyperarousal in the limbic system. This deactivates inherited fight, flight, freeze survival mechanisms that are no longer adaptive for much of daily life. Why is this important? Unrealistic fears, inappropriate anger, unnecessary avoidance, and other consequences of hyperarousal in the back brain are at the core of much of the psychological dysfunction our clients wrestle with. From anxiety to phobias to PTSD to addictions to depression to marital discord. Let's see how this played out in a tapping study that used fMRI imaging. The study was conducted by Peter Stapleton, a psychologist at Bond University in Australia, investigating EFT in the treatment of obesity. Many of you just saw her talking about a variety of studies about weight management. But for those of you who didn't, I'll briefly summarize one of them here. Incidentally, Dr. Stapleton was named Psychologist of the Year in 2019 at the Australia Allied Health Awards, so it is less easy to simply discount her findings. Plus, her groundbreaking research has appeared in numerous prominent journals. In this study, she showed that images of junk food, which activated hunger and craving, sent blood to reward and cognition centers of the brain that were not surprisingly associated with hunger and craving. But after a 4-week, 2-hour per week acupoint tapping program for weight management, the same food images produced little or no fMRI activation in those same brain regions. The decreased brain activation corresponded with a diminished desire for those foods. So by the end of 4 weeks, The tapping had delinked the association between thoughts of the food and cravings for the food. The existing neural network had to have been deactivated by the tapping program in order to accomplish this. The food images no longer arouse the areas of the brain that govern cravings. This has tremendous implications, not only for cravings, but also for unrealistic fear, anxiety, anger, guilt, and other core emotions. While eliminating cravings for unhealthy food is certainly different from eliminating the symptoms of PTSD, both involve survival mechanisms gone awry. The need for food and the need for safety are deeply embedded in the nervous system. And when the wiring for either gets attached to an inappropriate trigger, you can't easily talk yourself out of it. Triggers that lead to hyperarousal in brain areas that result in self-defeating emotional reactions are implicated in many psychological difficulties. The clinical advantages of being able to send signals that deactivate brain regions which trigger undesirable emotions or behavior, as shown in the food craving study, are obvious. But tapping can also activate targeted brain regions. Consider, for instance, the fear of flying. In a brain imaging study of a tapping session that successfully treated a flying phobia, the treatment, as would be expected, downregulated activity in brain regions involved in the fear response. But it also increased activity in brain regions involved with rational choices and managing emotional responses in stressful situations. This increased arousal in the brain's executive regions enhances the ability to manage difficult emotions when they do arise. It also strengthens confidence, coping skills, and proficiency in planning, organizing, and completing tasks. The term used in acupuncture for points that increase arousal are tonification points. Tonification points send activating signals to specific areas of the brain or body. Acupuncture points that decrease arousal are called sedation points. Sedation points send deactivating signals. While very few brain imaging studies have been conducted to date, the generalization from these preliminary findings, which is consistent with conclusions that can be drawn from the clinical trials, is that tapping on acupuncture points have these sedating and stimulating effects, not only in the management of fear, but also in working with other difficult emotions, such as excessive anger, jealousy, shame, or guilt. There is, however, still much we don't know. For instance, the specific effects of stimulating each of the acupuncture points used in energy psychology protocols have not been tracked with brain imaging equipment. But one more critical question can be tentatively answered. We know that tapping generates electrical signals. We know that these signals go to specific areas of the brain and may increase or decrease arousal in these brain areas. But how do the signals get to the specific parts of the brain that are involved with the problem being targeted? It's a very interesting question. Clinical observation and preliminary research suggest that the signals generated by the tapping go to the areas of the brain that have been activated by the words, the images, the memories, or the emotions that are active while tapping. So by selecting what the client brings to mind during the tapping, you are able to aim the regulating signals produced by the tapping to targeted brain regions with unusual precision. Other body-oriented psychotherapies, such as havening and somatic experiencing, can be extremely powerful in treating the after effects of trauma and other stressful life events. And these are sometimes used as the first line of intervention with highly traumatized people. With the precision by which you can move from inner experience to inner experience as you quickly tap down the arousal evoked by each is an enormous strength of working with acupoints. And it is the final building block for our sixth premise, which addresses the question, just what does tapping on acupuncture points do that might be therapeutic? Stimulating selected acupuncture points send signals that can increase or decrease arousal in targeted brain areas. So we have 6 empirically supported premises, which will serve as pillars as we continue to build our theory. Specifically, we can say that empirical evidence about acupoint tapping supports the premise that it works, it's fast, the benefits last, it impacts the body, it's shown by biological markers for cortisol, gene expression, and immune response. It changes the brain, such as disabling neural networks that activate cravings when thinking of a specific food. And it's the tapping that brings about the most striking benefits. Our theory building can now return to our initial question: how can acupoint tapping change deep emotional learnings? So we're about halfway through, and I know I'm already giving you a lot of information, so let's take a second and just do a little energy clearing by going from your left shoulder, dig in behind the shoulder, pull over the shoulder and come to the opposite hip, and other shoulder, breathing again and again and again and again. Shake it out. Okay, so far we've established that tapping on acupuncture points combined with well-chosen wording or images can send signals to the brain that lead to improvement for a range of psychological and physiological conditions. We also know that the improvements are fast and that they last. But the 6 premises do not explain what is happening in the brain that causes the improvements to last. How is it that deep emotional learnings are being permanently altered after a tapping session? So that's our next question. Why do the improvements last? For instance, if you apply tapping while bringing to mind something that makes you angry, like if someone has publicly accused you of having done something you didn't do, but after a few rounds of tapping, you're no longer feeling angry. The tapping sends signals to the brain that reduced arousal in the limbic system. Great, the anger was diffused. But why wouldn't the anger be triggered again the next time you are reminded of the situation when you aren't tapping? Or the next time a person with a height phobia encounters a height, or any other trigger that was diffused while the tapping was being done. Yet the evidence is that the changes last. Both clinical experience and the outcome research show that once a problematic emotional response in all its aspects have been fully addressed with tapping, it tends not to return. What are the mechanisms that make the changes durable? To examine this process, we need to understand the mental models that sustain our patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. Mental models are the lenses through which we perceive the world, make our interpretations about it, respond emotionally, and then act. Our perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors will correspond with our mental models. Mental models may be global, such as the world is safe or unsafe. If your mental model is that the world is unsafe, that is what you will see in the world. Everything looks unsafe. And you will act accordingly. Or, I'm an unworthy person. And guess what? You look at the world and you find evidence that you're unworthy. Or, men can't be trusted. And guess who you'll pick out of a crowd? Hey, there's one. Let's be friends. In addition to these global mental models may be more specific, such as children require strict discipline. I think Johnny's just smirked at me. Johnny, you are grounded. Mental models can be even more specific. For instance, after surviving being in a war zone, a person might have viscerally learned that a sudden bright light means mortal danger. When an unexpected bright light is encountered, the overwhelming response is to duck for cover. Cognitive behavior therapy has been so successful in part because of its facility for working with mental models and the relationships among mental models, emotions, and behaviors. Mental models are also called cognitive structures or mental maps or internal schemas. As we will see, energy psychology has some unique strengths for quickly dismantling outmoded or otherwise dysfunctional mental models and replacing them with ones that are more current and adaptive. So we're going to take a more thorough look at mental models. First, how do mental models evolve? Let's imagine each gear as a different mental model. Mental models govern every aspect of your life, from your sense of safety to the way you relate to your closest friend to how you approach your job. Despite this vast oversimplification of enormously complex neural processes, we're building a map that will be useful in understanding how mental models can be altered using energy psychology. Mental models operate beneath the surface of consciousness, often with no recollection of the experiences that were the basis of the mental model. This is important because mental models feel like reality, not like elaborations upon earlier experiences, which is what they really are. And when a mental model is engaged, it starts to run the show in your inner life, evoking the programmed emotions, thoughts, and behaviors dictated by the model. The brain holds many mental models. Mental models are interlocked, building on and influencing one another. If a core mental model is that you can succeed at anything you try, this will pattern the mental models your brain creates as you take on a new project. The mental models that become the focus of psychotherapy are generally built around trauma, deep emotional wounds, or overwhelming circumstances. They were formed in the past as attempts to stay safe and stable in the face of threatening experiences. The brain treats these core models as survival strategies. Each is hard-won, emotionally embedded, and will not change easily. They are, in fact, maintained by extraordinarily durable networks of neural pathways. And they often keep us locked in self-defeating ways of coping. Not only do they not change easily, for most people throughout history, their fundamental mental models could never be cast off. Even psychotherapy, which attempts to produce deep change in self-defeating mental models, often winds up helping people slightly refine, but mostly adapt to their long-standing mental models. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, helping people operate more effectively within ways of thinking they have developed over a lifetime. They may even appreciate the help, but it doesn't really free them from the self-limiting theme of the old model. The dilemma is captured in Albert Einstein's often quoted observation that problems cannot be solved with the same mindset that created them. Effective psychotherapy, on the other hand, can completely dismantle and replace a deeply embedded but self-defeating emotional learning. Let's look at how this might occur. First, new experiences must forcefully contradict the existing model. The only way core mental models change, in fact, is when new experiences do not conform to them. We're seeing this writ large at the societal level with the coronavirus. It is presenting us with vivid experiences that prevailing beliefs and behaviors are undermining our security and sustainability. Will our cultural models change as a result? That is a great unanswered question. For cultures, as well as for our clients during a time of personal crisis, when a new experience contradicts a governing model, there are three possibilities. What usually happens is that the mental model is strong enough and durable enough to distort any information that does not match the model. And nothing changes. But if the new information keeps coming in again and again, or if the person is in a particularly receptive state, the new information may be integrated, a step toward gradually modifying the mental model, but its underlying theme usually persists. For the mental model to be replaced by a new model with a different theme, the new experience must dramatically disconfirm the mental model. We'll focus on this third process because it is the essential neurological requirement for far-reaching therapeutic change. Deeply embedded emotional learnings are survival strategies developed by the limbic system for carrying on physically and or emotionally. Although they don't change easily, evolution did have to allow for new experiences that render earlier learnings obsolete. So it endowed the brain with two mechanisms for changing outdated mental models. The first, as we just saw, is the gradual integration of new information, with an emphasis on gradual. Our survival strategies are remarkably stable. The second is more radical, a complete dismantling and replacement of an underlying mental model. While the brain doesn't do this often, it can do it quite quickly. And energy psychology is very good at bringing this about. Two very specific conditions must be met for this to occur. First, the mental model must be activated. Second, an experience that emotionally and potently contradicts the mental model must occur while the old model is still operating. Cartoon sums it up in a single image. This shows the necessary conditions for dismantling an outdated mental model and creating a new one. First, the existing mental model must be activated and experienced emotionally. Second, the new experience must viscerally contradict what the existing model expects or predicts. Here's what the mental model expects. Here's what it was experienced. This emotionally palpable contradiction paves the way for the new experience to counter and replace the old mental model. The neurochemistry of how this works has been studied for more than 2 decades as a process called memory reconsolidation. The key finding is that when a new experience vividly contradicts an old mental model, the brain can literally erase the mental model, or at least parts of it that were contradicted. Natural neural networks whose instruction is proven to be outdated based on strong emotional experience can be quickly eradicated. Neurologists call this depotentiation. I've detailed this process as it applies to energy psychology in a published peer-reviewed paper. You can get it from the ACEP conference website or from www.overviewpaperenergypsyched.com. Here we'll keep our focus on the clinical applications rather than the full theory. The challenge for bringing about this type of transformation in the context of psychotherapy is how do you create the necessary conditions? There's actually an age-old question for therapists. How do you shift a temporary state of being into becoming a neurologically wired permanent trait? How do you turn a promising moment during therapy, a fleeting insight, a momentary feeling of new confidence, an untroubled response to what had been an anxiety-provoking trigger, into the new normal? Research shows that even after a powerfully inspiring residential workshop, lasting change is far from automatic. How do you embed temporary therapeutic victories into a neural network that will maintain them? Again, only 2 conditions are necessary to initiate such deep transformation in a core mental model. But in everyday life, these conditions don't occur in combination all that often. The first, as we just saw, is to activate the emotion of the outdated mental model. That's the easy part. It's probably already happening frequently in the person's life. The second step is the tricky part, to create an experience that contradicts the existing model, while the old model is still emotionally active. This pairing doesn't occur spontaneously. An unexpected, vivid experience must be introduced if an outdated mental model is to be neurologically eradicated. Many therapeutic systems haven't even conceptualized this process, so it has to happen by chance or through therapeutic intuition. and highly successful therapists do intuitively create these conditions. A growing number of approaches are also systematically attempting to bring about these conditions, such as by inducing a, quote, corrective emotional experience. Basically, 3 types of strategies are possible within this framework. The first is to find an experience from the client's past that vividly contradicts the existing model while that model is still emotionally active. The second, as we've been playfully illustrating here, is to induce or access more recent experiences that vividly contradict the old learning, while the old model is still emotionally active. To make the cartoon more applicable, think of the box as the part of the brain that holds the associations that trigger unrealistic assessments, fears, anger, or other problematic emotions. The needed step for this strategy to work is to evoke a powerful positive emotion or bodily sensation that is the opposite of what the old model expects. In the cartoon, we see the girl's joy about the unexpected puppy immediately following her fear of danger. Neurologists call this mismatch between what the mental model predicts and what actually occurs a prediction error. Prediction errors are the required ingredient of a deeply embedded emotional learning is to lose its influence. The third strategy, using this same principle, is that while the model is active, invoke a situation within the therapeutic relationship that vividly contradicts the old model. All of these require considerable therapeutic finesse to accomplish by design. How do energy psychology protocols reliably facilitate transformative change? Strangely, it's not by plan. It is, in fact, one of the most fortunate accidents I've ever seen in the therapeutic approach. When you bring to mind an invasive emotion, self-defeating behavior, or challenging situation, the mental model associated with that feeling, behavior, or situation is activated. This is partially conscious and partially outside your awareness. Whether or not the components of a mental model are consciously registered, they include the experiences that led to the formation of the model's perceptual filters, beliefs, automatic thoughts, emotional responses, and programmed behaviors. These are the aspects of an emotional issue. They reveal themselves progressively as the session proceeds. By staying alert and tapping on them, deactivating signals are sent to the areas of the brain that maintain the outdated mental model. This is where the speed of acupoint tapping is a game changer. Being able to rapidly reduce hyperarousal in targeted brain areas results in the prediction errors that are necessary to change a mental model. As you follow what the client presents, you get to the core of the mental model that is governing the presenting problem. The metaphor of peeling the layers of the onion, often used in the energy psychology trainings, is applicable. You eventually reach the heart of the mental model, its physiological nucleus, to borrow Abram Gardner's term. When you deactivate that, the person's experience will differ dramatically from what the mental model expects. Quite accidentally, or at least fortuitously, you have met the 2 conditions that are required for eliminating an outdated mental model. First, you have activated the mental model. This will have occurred by the time the person has described the issue of concern and given it a sudden rating. Second, you have within a brief period of time, called the reconsolidation window, created an experience that vividly contradicts it. A new model will be formed that is based on the recent experience. Let's watch a brief video that shows how this works in an energy psychology session. Earlier, we viewed a brain imaging study that involved the treatment of a phobia. Let's focus in specifically on the way a tapping protocol can create an experience that contradicts what the mental model predicts in overcoming a phobia. Remember, that is the essential condition that must be met for rapid healing and transformation. This 2.5-minute video shows excerpts from a 30-minute treatment of a long-standing height phobia.
literally going to tip forward. Just fall over.
Okay.
I'm shaking.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. So
I don't want to look
that's
close to
plenty.
my
So
eyes.
just back off now in a comfortable way. Turn
Now
around.
I'm okay.
Yeah. Turn around and go back in now. Nancy rated her distress when she would think of facing a height on a scale of 0 to 10.
It's a 10.
It's a 10. Yeah, so it looked like a 10, didn't it? The treatment consisted of tapping a series of acupuncture points about 7 times each. Nancy again rated her distress when thinking of facing a height.
I'd say somewhere around a 6.
It's down to a 6 from a 10. Okay.
I don't feel that pulling forward.
You don't feel that pulling forward.
Yeah.
The entire sequence was repeated. And go inside and imagine that you're coming up to the edge there. And
It's gone.
it's gone. Okay.
Gone.
Okay, good. Now, we're not done yet, but it's great that it's gone. Okay? One of the things that, just gonna let that absorb. Yeah. And you don't know if it's gonna translate yet.
I know. That's what I'm afraid of.
Yeah.
Again, you saw the moment of transformation where the new experience contradicted what the old model predicted. In 2.5-year follow-up, Nancy still had no fear of heights. This is the process that is occurring beneath the surface when an energy psychology protocol changes a deep emotional learning. And it is where energy psychology shines. You trigger the problematic emotion because you can instantly tap it down while the mental model is still active. You have in that moment created the emotionally vivid experience that counters the old model. And it isn't just for phobias. It is the same process you just witnessed for a wide range of conditions. Remember the reduced food cravings we saw earlier. Let's see how it worked there. When a food that causes cravings is mentally activated while tapping, signals are sent that deactivate arousal in the areas of the brain associated with the food cravings. This results in no craving, even in the presence of the food. This momentary experience is the mismatch, the prediction error that causes the old mental model to be eradicated and replaced by a mental model that is based on the new experience. Let's sum up all we've explored into a statement that summarizes the theory we've been formulating. Our theory building has actually had 2 parts. Part 1, tapping on selected acupuncture points, combined with words, images, memories, or emotions, can send activating or deactivating signals to brain areas that regulate problematic behavior, emotions, or beliefs. That is part 1 of our theory, and we've established 6 pillars that support this statement. Now on to address what the 6 pillars don't explain, which is why the changes are permanent. This is part 2 of our theory. The activation or deactivation of the brain areas that is produced by tapping lasts beyond the tapping. And this is because the experience is dramatically different from what the existing mental model expects or predicts. The mental model of the girl with the puppy was, in essence, whatever I haven't experienced is dangerous. But the new experience, that seemingly dangerous box held a puppy, depotentiates the model and opens the way for the psyche to create a new model based on the new and novel experience. Some things that seem dangerous can hold nice surprises if you don't avoid them. Now, as promised, let's look at how our theory applies to Bob's PTSD treatment. How did Bob get from here to here? With tapping protocols, the brain gets opposing signals. The client is asked to bring to mind an anxiety-provoking memory, thought, or cue. This engages the mental model, sending activating signals to the limbic system, which can have the power of the original formative experience. Turning on the alarm response. But the simultaneous stimulation of acupoints by tapping on them sends deactivating signals to the limbic system, initiating an opposing process. After a number of rounds of tapping on all relevant aspects, the deactivating signals begin to dominate, turning off the alarm response. Even with the trigger still present, the inner distress is not produced. The alarm response has been turned off. So Bob could bring to mind traumatic war memories without reliving the trauma. This was the prediction error. The new experience didn't match what the mental model predicted. Remember when he said, "It's amazing how I feel right now. I can actually talk about it calmly." You saw him registering that something big had changed. While the client doesn't always show the same strong surprise that Bob and Nancy showed, the psyche is dealing with an experience that is a surprise in relationship to what the mental model expected. What Bob's mental model predicted and expected, what actually occurred. This mismatch meets the requirements for dismantling a mental model. The neural network was depotentiated. Let's watch that little snippet again.
The next day, we collapsed it still further and further and further till he would just talk about it like it was nothing.
We just started pulling bodies out.
And how many bodies were there?
I think all total there was 15 killed. It's amazing how I feel right now. I can actually
The old model
talk about it
that
calmly.
kept Bob emotionally trapped in his war memories has been depotentiated and replaced with a new mental model, which is the source of the changes on follow-up. His suicidal thoughts had ceased, his paranoia had ceased, his fear of heights were gone. He was no longer anxious, he had stopped having nightmares, his fear of crowds, which kept him isolated, was gone. Durable results like these, after tapping treatments, are consistent with the findings from dozens of clinical trials. Our theory has been able to provide a plausible explanation of the neural and psychological mechanisms that resulted in what we witnessed with Bob's treatment. Reduced arousal while war memories are active leads to a prediction error, which opens the way for a new mental model consistent with a recent vivid experience. I know when we sum it up this way, it seems simplistic, but this economy of concepts is what you want in a theory. It provides a lens that brings focus to the essential elements of a complex process. I hope you will find it a useful lens for understanding the puzzling yet incredibly powerful tool that acupoint tapping adds to our ability to help people transform deeply embedded learnings that no longer serve them. Thank you.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you again so much for just all. I know you've worked super hard on this, and I think once again this is just an incredible gift to the field. Clear, concise, pure David Feinsteinianism, and we're just always super pleased. Thank you, David.
Thank you.